School of Journalism. Welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Following the Arab Spring, gender equality between men and women in the Middle East is improving. Women today have more opportunities, both in business and in society, than they did in previous years. Two journalists set out to learn just how the landscape has changed for Arab women and have published their stories in a book called Arab Women Rising. Today on Global Journalist, we talk to the authors of the book about their project and what they found. I'm joined today from Washington, D.C. by journalist Nafisa Saeed and from New York City by journalist Rahila Zafar. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
I wanted to start out, in your book you profile 35 women entrepreneurs from around the Arab world. I was particularly interested in two women that you profiled in Tunisia, Nafisa. I was wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about the woman who had started a garbage removal business and then also a woman who was running a flower farm there.
Sure. Thanks for having us. The woman, the first woman you're referring to is Wafa Sayadi, and she actually was elected a couple years ago to head an organization that represents and promotes young entrepreneurs. And so she said she just knew she wanted to be her own boss, and she was looking around for an idea, and she realized how dirty and how polluted and the beaches are, and Tunisia has a spectacular shoreline. So she created a contract with the city and with the government, and she was able to clean the beaches and create jobs for people and provide a service that no one had been doing. And she says that she both is able to do something that's environmentally friendly, but also help people provide jobs. And the name of her company is called ProClean.
And is this something that a woman in Tunisia wouldn't have been able to do a decade ago?
No, women in Tunisia it's known as having some of the most, quote unquote, progressive or open laws around women. And so it's not necessarily that she would not have been able to do it, but we have to look at the context pre and post Arab Spring. Before the Arab Spring, which started in Tunisia, former President Zainuddin Ben Ali had a tight grip on business in the private sector, particularly around his wife's family, who generally got contracts if there was any bids, and they were the ones that really ran a lot of private businesses. So it was difficult for independent people or for people who were not connected to these quote-unquote families who were close to Ben Ali to really have a shot at starting their own businesses. So what you could say is that now people like Wafa and others who may not have had the chance or access to those circles are now able to do that and have a fairer bid in winning contracts and starting businesses such as this.
And one of the other women that you profiled in Tunisia had run a flower export farm as well. That sounded like quite a substantial operation. Can you tell us just a little bit about that as well?
That's Jalila Tamallah, who you're speaking about. I met her, with her boots, long boots on, walking around the mud in her fields, where you see her beautiful blossoms coming out of the ground. She's a very husky woman, very
well, we're losing the audio on you, Nafisa, just a minute, so we'll come back to you in just a moment. Rahila, there was another person that you profiled in Arab Women Rising that I thought was quite interesting, and that was Adela bint Abdullah bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, the daughter of the King of Saudi Arabia. Tell us about her, because most people wouldn't associate the Al Saud dynasty with women's empowerment.
Well, it's refreshing to see, I think, how dynamic a lot of the women from the Al Saud family are. And I think Princess Adela is a good representative of also how so many of them are completely engaged with every facet of society and how women at all socioeconomic levels in Saudi Arabia are living and some of the challenges that they face. So I think Princess Adela has really used her position to advocate against domestic violence. And she told me that she was most proud of her father for, passing laws making, domestic violence, passing laws against domestic violence. And then also, I think in such a tech-savvy society, it's just amazing to see the type of videos that they've come up with in terms of, not only publicly saying that domestic violence is wrong, but also having very, very compelling viral videos, raising awareness of it, and I think the purpose of it is it's getting, mainstream society to talk about the issue.
With respect to Saudi Arabia, too, one of the things that's mentioned in the foreword to your book is the lingerie revolution that occurred there starting in 2008. Tell us a little bit about that and why it was significant.
Well, it was the first time that Saudi women were given the right to work in retail. And what's been amazing about it is since the Minister of Labor have, passed the laws and enabled women to go and work in retail, Princess Rima bint Bandar Al Saud, she owns a license to Harvey Nichols and a lot of other retail companies. She was willing to take almost a 50% pay cut to integrate women into her stores. And that's something that I think is a really big move because, she'll flat out say that there'll be some women that will walk into Harvey Nichols, for example, and their average purchase may be like $13,000 every time they walk in the store, but they don't like seeing other women working. And they'll say things to them that you should be ashamed to work in, a mixed gender environment. Even though the Minister of Labor has really strict laws on how far men and women can stand from each other, like the break rooms are private, and, they've really done a lot to never have it be in a situation where men and women are interacting alone in that type of workplace setting in a retail store. And I think she was just willing to take criticism from people. And not only that, but she really invested in having free daycare for women and also free transportation for women that work in her stores. And I think that that's a major move, especially in a country where, women aren't allowed to drive.
Sure. And just to be clear, then, this sort of revolution that allowed women to work in retail, then it began in underwear shops in Saudi Arabia, basically.
Yeah, and Reem Assad began the campaign, interestingly enough, on Facebook. I think it just sort of shows in terms of how tech savvy this society is and how powerful social media is. So on one hand, you have women that are, just getting the chance to work in retail, and they've never had any previous work experience. But on the other hand, it's a society where there's more college graduates than men, and there's a significant number of women in computer science. So when you visit the technology incubators in Saudi Arabia, half of the people in them are women. It's a much higher ratio than what you see in the United States.
And how many of those women actually go on to work in the technology industry? Because I think, many people wouldn't associate Saudi Arabia with women's empowerment, given that women functionally, it's difficult for them to leave the home without a male guardian. They can't drive. They're effectively treated as minors by the legal system.
Well, I think it's fascinating to see how many women, I think every single day there's dozens of women starting businesses on Instagram in Saudi Arabia. And there is a company called Glowworks that specialized in getting women with technology skills into the workforce, and that company was acquired for $16 million. So, and I think that there's a lot of support as well from the king and the government incentivizing companies to integrate women into the workforce.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Today we're talking to the authors of the book Arab Women Rising about their project and how the landscape for women in the Middle East is changing. I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by journalist Nafisa Saeed and from New York City by journalist Rahila Zafar. You can listen to this and other full episodes of Global Journalist on our website. That's globaljournalist.org. For more Global Journalist content, you can also like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter @GlobalJourn. Nafisa Saeed, I wanted to ask you as well, there were two women that you profiled, Sally Sabri and Doa Zaki, These are Egyptian women that developed products for nursing mothers and began quite a successful business based around those types of products. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? In a way, it's quite surprising to hear that some of these products weren't available in Egypt.
The idea for Best Moms is the name of their company came first when one of their friends had brought a breastfeeding cover from the US, and they thought this is a great product that should be introduced into the Egyptian market. Neither of them were businesswomen or had started a business before. Dua Zeki is actually a dentist, and Sally Sabri, who you mentioned, said she always knew she wanted to do something on her own. And so they went themselves to the textile stores in different parts of Cairo. They used Egyptian cotton, Egyptian-made products to actually manufacture first the nursing covers. They slowly were building up their product base, placing them in stores, selling them online, and now they've expanded to other items as well related to parenting and home items. But a lot of it came from what they thought was providing a service, but also creating jobs again within their own country. And they really take care in the design and each kind of the quality that they always say they emphasize as well. And this really started in their homes. When I visited, even let's say a couple years ago until now, it's grown. They have their own office. But when they started out, they were packaging. They had their whole family would be there. The kids would be helping, putting the products into the package, driving to the store. And what was interesting to listen from them was how this was able to really fulfill certain things that they were interested in, but also create economic opportunity. Dua says in the piece in the book where she talks about how there was a moment when her husband had lost his job, and the income from Best Moms, their company, really helped, boost their family for that time while he was out of a job. And so you see how being an entrepreneur or having a side business, even if it's something you start in your home, can grow and create economic opportunities for a woman, but also for her family.
And I wanted to ask you as well, when you were interviewing the subjects for this book, this was at the time of the Arab Spring and its immediate aftermath. In the past year, we've seen sort of the promise of the Arab Spring wither. The military is back in charge in Egypt. There's obviously large conflict in Syria and parts of Iraq, in Gaza. In some places like Bahrain or Sudan, the Arab Spring was sort of nipped in the bud. So how is this sort of reversal of the Arab Spring, how has that affected the roles of women and women entrepreneurs?
I think what's fascinating for Rahila and I in our observations, beginning interviews over from the Arab Spring until now, continuing, is that in spite of, the ongoing turmoil, let's say in Egypt, or even economic uncertainty, continuing political transition, Yemen, Egypt, Tunisia, where I spent a lot of time, is that even with the ongoing uncertainty or unrest, you still see innovation and entrepreneurship happening in those circumstances. And let's be honest, we know that there is very high unemployment in these societies. There is not a lot of economic growth going on since the Arab Spring revolutions. And so people are taking matters into their own hands and saying, let's create opportunities for ourselves. So even though there have been setbacks, obviously, politically or economically, there's still this idea that, we can continue to grow in spite of what's going on. And I would also add that, as Rahila had mentioned, the tech sector, where people, as you will see in the book, they talk about how technology can be used to help solve a lot of challenges that society is facing, whether in health or education, and how do you use new mobile technologies, how do you use the new space of the internet to help create products, software, services that address issues within society. And that a lot of that got a boost from the spirit of the Arab Spring, of how can we use tools, how can we engage and create things that actually help society. And so I think that's also important, that has continued, in other sectors that we may not see, even with, the daily headlines that we see. And with the ongoing daily headlines we see, and I've been in the middle of those, tear gas protests, riots, that this is another way for us to look at how are people creating economic opportunities for themselves, even while this is going on. And you hear stories coming out of Syria and Iraq still of this kind of innovation happening
Well,
in what we would consider unlikely places.
I want to ask you as well about another woman that you profile. You mentioned technology. That's Ezra El Cheff, who's an advocate for migrant rights, who's also developed a series of web platforms, including crowdvoice.org, which tracks protests around the world, mideasttunes.com, which is a site for underground music. What can you tell us about her and what she sort of represents?
Well, I profiled her in Bahrain, and she's amazing. I mean, she's a young woman. She's only in her mid-20s, and I think that as when she was just a young, starting from grade school and high school, it really bothered her a lot seeing how badly migrant workers were treated in Bahrain. And she, really saw the internet as a tool to push for change. And, I think it's just amazing to see how she's gotten money from Pierre Amidiar, among other people in Silicon Valley. And she's also very brave. I think
Midiar is the founder of eBay, correct?
Yeah. And I think it's just amazing to see as well how she's very brave in the sense of, she's a TED fellow, she's an Echoing Green fellow, but she won't show her face publicly, just because, she is living in Bahrain, and she does have to worry about just in terms of her freedom of speech and, her safety. And one thing that I think is very remarkable about her as well is oftentimes her sites are shut down in Bahrain, but she'll keep going, and she's managed to, build this amazing network and global community. And also she just keeps innovating. I think she started an app recently that focuses on like the history of protests around the world. She started Mideast Tunes, which is a platform for activist bands across the region.
I want to follow up with you, Nafisa, as well. To what extent is this phenomenon, is this something that is really a product just for the elite? In other words, is it the women who are the daughters of people who are already wealthy or prominent in the Arab world who are going out and doing these things? To what extent are the lives of women sort of in the villages, in the poorer suburbs of Cairo or Damascus, how much are their lives really changing?
Indeed, there are huge challenges. There's still, very high illiteracy in rural and urban areas. I mean, I think neither Hillary would deny any of these big challenges, whether it's with education or social attitudes that might, get in the way, or obviously economic opportunity. At the same time, I would say that when you look at the survey of the women in our book, we have, from the Saudi royals all the way to, like you mentioned, the flower farmer. And then you also see that it's not just, I think, an elite or that it's only at the top. I think you'll also see a lot of entrepreneurship and development around the middle class as well. And I think that's an interesting area to look at, because it's not just people who went to the American University of Cairo or American University of Beirut. We have some of those people in our book, and they're doing great work. But there's also now, I think, more opportunity, but also people pushing their way from middle class in that area as well. And then, for instance, the flower farmer, there are institutions that are now also helping boost people from whether rural or lower income neighborhoods by creating opportunities such as microfinancing, which is how the flower farmer in Tunisia was able to get funding for her business. So there are different outlets now that are trying to create funding or seed funding or what it might be for women who may not have that, just say, I borrowed $1 million from my parents. And I think that's what I really found fascinating, especially in places like Egypt and Tunisia and Yemen as well, where they don't have the kind of wealth that the Gulf countries have, but you do see them creating economic opportunities. And another important point to mention is that in a lot of instances, women are the ones who may be the breadwinners in their family, and so they're the ones that have to again create these opportunities for themselves, whether they like it or not. Then those are often called entrepreneurs out of necessity.
Mm-hmm.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Today we're talking to the authors of the book Arab Women Rising about their project and how the landscape for women in the Middle East is changing. I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by journalist Nafisa Saeed and from New York City by journalist Rahila Zafar. You can listen to this and other full episodes of Global Journalist on our website. That's globaljournalist.org. For more Global Journalist content, you can also like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter @GlobalJourn. Nafisa, I wanted to ask you as well, how is this rise of women entrepreneurs, how is it regarded by Islamist parties in the Arab world, which have done quite well whenever we've seen elections occur?
Well, if you want to talk about them first as movements and their long history in places like Egypt or, presence now in Yemen and winning elections in Tunisia, first of all, they've had a strong presence in business communities, business class. They've had lots of members for years that have been part of that. So in terms of, they have that reach, but then also seeing how they've had strong branches of or wings of their, for women specifically in terms of recruitment, creating centers, whether it's for education or technology. For instance, I can use the example in Yemen where the Islah Party has offered classes or literacy classes or computer classes for women at its centers, or in Egypt has a long history of many different activities, women being active. So first of all, it's looking at the women actually very active in the parties, and so there's that presence. You can have another discussion in terms of, the views or ideology or philosophies within the party about different subjects or their stances on different issues. That's another discussion. But right now, and just in terms of looking at their role in the party, women are members of the National Constituent Assembly right now in Tunisia from Ennahda, which is the Islamist party in Tunisia. So you see women already in leadership roles in these parties, active sort of in the campaigning fronts. So they have that role already, and I don't think that they would consider women involved in business as anything outside of what they find acceptable, in terms of involvement politically and economically in that sphere. And they've called for involvement, in terms of in the economic and business sector as well. And some of them are businesswomen themselves, and then will join politics. If you want to talk about their views specifically on, certain laws or policies and how that relates to gender, and that's another discussion. But in terms of generally to answer your question, I would say that, they have business women who are members of their party for sure.
So generally, they've been supportive of women's economic empowerment then, on the whole, you'd say?
Right, because they are big supporters of women's education as a way of, outreach as well, and, pushing their message, whether it's in rural Egypt or in, inner cities of Tunisia or in places like Yemen. I'm using those examples because that is where I spent a lot of time and have studied this. Or even in Libya now, you see that, or in Morocco also has active Islamist parties. So because they have, supported women's education, and whether you want to discuss that is because that, helps in their recruitment or increases their reach, that is something that has been a cornerstone of, of their approach.
Rahila Zafar, I wanted to ask you as well. I understand that you spent some time in Gaza and in the Palestinian-occupied territories. I can't imagine a more difficult place to be an entrepreneur, much less a woman entrepreneur, than in Gaza right now. Can you tell us a little bit about how women entrepreneurs are faring there and what sorts of spaces they are creating for themselves?
Well, I spent time in the West Bank, and I was planning to go to Gaza for the first time this September through their first accelerator called Gaza Sky Geeks, which was set up by Mercy Corps and also supported by Google. And I've just been amazed because I have been following women that were part of the accelerator And NPR did a story in June, just before the conflict began, about how half of the women part of the accelerator are women. Well, half of the people part of the accelerator are women. And I think they had initially contacted Nafisa and I a few months ago saying that they're starting to have people from venture capitalist firms and companies like Google come in and mentor the entrepreneurs. And because there's so many women, they needed more women mentors in tech. And I've just been completely amazed by many of these young women have lost their homes, they've lost family members, but the opportunity to be part of a startup, and the startup is something that they never knew existed like a year ago, means everything to them. And they're, a lot of them are computer science majors or engineering majors or business majors, and they just, have built their first app. They have business development plans. They're receiving outside funding. One woman is Mariam Abu Atawi, and she has a transportation app called Waselni. And I think it's just amazing how they're right back to work right now in terms of testing their app and moving forward. And I think it's important because it's providing work opportunities that they didn't have before. I think one young woman, before she started her company, she was working in a hotel in Gaza, and she said that most of her wages went towards transportation to get to work. Her father had passed away, so it's just incredible to see this whole new sector open up for these young women.
And Nafisa Saeed, with just about a minute to go, I wanted to ask you, you've spoken about the empowerment of women economically in the Arab world. How is that translating into other sectors of society? In other words, are we likely to see that women are likely to gain more reproductive rights or political rights or other rights as a result of having more economic power, or is that not really translating at this point?
Well, in terms of looking at, how people want to see change within their societies, and I think there's, at their own pace or at their own taste of how they want to see that, that's going to be up to them. And I think you do see people, like I said, taking matters into their own hands, deciding when and how that will happen. One of the most important, I think, places to look and how women's leadership, both right now we're seeing as women are very active politically in places, if you want to use extreme examples like in Yemen or Libya, where we have a lot of stereotypes of women not really being in the public square, where actually they have been on the streets since 2011 every week out there, and they're now becoming part of the political process. Another sector to really look at is the tech sector, where a lot of lines around gender are really being dissolved because it's a very equal playing field, where if you got the skills, you can code, no one's going to question you, and you are seeing women really at the forefront and as leaders. And if that helps change certain social attitudes that people or perceptions may have around women, you're really going to see that because women on their own are taking initiative and being respected and recognized for their skills and for their knowledge and their innovation.
That's all for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Our thanks to our guests Nafisa Saeed and Rahila Zafar. They're the authors of Arab Women Rising, an ebook downloadable from Amazon.com. Casey Morell is our executive producer, and our lead producer this week is Zara Rasool. Travis McMillan from RJI is our technical director. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.